All right, guys, well, welcome to the Pulse of Miami Church. And today we're going to finish the narrative part of Daniel. Now, Daniel has, just so you guys know, he's got a whole lot of prophecies that are fascinating, but I'm kind of going through the stories of Scripture. So I'm going to skip over those prophecies. Obviously, next week and the week after, we're going to focus on the New Testament with Easter, but then we're going to continue the story after Easter. We're going to talk about Nehemiah and rebuilding Israel, basically. So today is the final story of Daniel, and we have yet another king that we're going to talk about. But you know what? I'll be honest with you. I'm kind of tired of talking about the kings. Remember, we talked about King Nebuchadnezzar. And how he was kind of humbled by God, and it took that really humble moment for him to finally submit himself to God, right? We talked last week about his grandson, Belshazzar, and how he was rebellious. Today we're actually going to talk about the new king, King Darius. He's the king of the Medes that has taken over. But you know what? I don't want to focus on him. What I want to focus on is poor Daniel. Because by this time, Daniel's really old. Like, he's old. He should be retired by now. And over again, Daniel's life has been on the line because he was faithful to God. Every time he's faithful to God, it seems like his life is on the line. Right? You guys, story after story. He's told, if you don't do this, then you're going to die. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Right? If you don't bow down and worship this idol, then you're going to be thrown into the furnace. And today we're going to find that he's put yet into this position again. And the question that I want to ask is, why would anyone want to be faithful to God if it brings so much trouble? Why would anyone want to be faithful to God if it brings you so much trouble? There's a little part of me that wants to go, I wish I could go back in time to Daniel. Remember that first story when Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were like, okay, we're Jews. We've been, taken into captivity. And they brought them food at the king's table, and they're like, no, we won't eat it. It's got bacon in it. Jews aren't supposed to eat bacon. Right? And they said, just eat vegetables and water. And there's a little part of me that goes, are you guys sure? Right? Like, there's a lot of trouble that comes out of that. Why would anybody want to be faithful to God if it brings so much trouble? And you know what? This is not just the story of Daniel. Something that a lot of you guys may not know about me. I grew up in church. And back in junior high, now just by me saying junior high, that dates me, right? Because it's like middle school now, which doesn't even make sense. How can you have a senior high if you don't have a junior high? But anyway, I digress, right? Back in junior high, I took a stand for Christ. And you know what? I paid the price. I took a stand for Christ in the only way that I kind of knew how. And there was some kids who didn't like that. And they were very popular in the school. And they got every other kid in the entire school to hate me. I was ridiculed, which the ridiculing isn't that bad. Like, you know how people are like, sticks and stones may break your bones, but names will never hurt you? It's kind of true. But then the kids brought the sticks and the stones, right? And I started getting beat up. And so every time I would actually go to PE, there was an opportunity in the locker room, and I'd get my head banged into the lockers. During lunch, kids would gang up on me. Because, people had spread lies about me, how they had said all kinds of stuff, that I was a racist and all kinds of crazy, just because I had taken a stand for Christ in one class. And it was hard because nobody wanted to be my friend. Kids who had grown up with me, my best friends in elementary school, I'll never forget the day that they called my mom because we had a carpool. They called my mom and they said, we don't want to be seen with your son anymore. We don't want to go carpool. I remember it got so bad, guys, that, and my mom was she knew everything that was going on, and it was killing her on the inside. I remember I would get so nervous and anxious before going to school because it was just pure torture. And I remember riding in the car one day, and my legs were shaking. Like, I was so nervous they were shaking, and I couldn't get them to stop. But my mom was driving, like, right next to me, and I knew that it was killing her that I was going through this, and I didn't want her to feel bad. And so I remember holding my knees with my hands because I didn't want my mom to see. Now, luckily, that year passed, and I learned my lesson. Shut your mouth. You don't say anything about Jesus because it gets you in trouble. And so the rest of my years in junior high and high school, I didn't really live for Christ. Because I asked the question, why would anyone want to be faithful to God if it brings you so much trouble? And you know, maybe you're not going to be beat up. But I can guarantee you this, if you let people know that you're a Christian, they're going to hold you to a higher standard than everybody else. They're going to be like, oh, and you call yourself a Christian. Have you ever heard anybody say that to you? And you call yourself a Christian. When you do the exact same thing that everybody else is doing, it's fine for everybody else. Right? Yeah, you're going to be held to a higher standard. That's why I don't put bumper stickers on my cars, like Christian bumper stickers. Right? Because I'm a little older now. I'm a little calmer. But every once in a while, I like to drive like an idiot. Right? Like, I love it. And I don't want to have like a Christian bumper sticker. Like, look at this Christian. You know? Maybe if you take a stand for Christ, you're going to get grief from your friends and your family. You know, Raul's not here today, but he actually took a stand for Christ, actually started sharing his faith when he was working at AT&T. And he got ridiculed for it. There was this one guy, he's a real machismo guy, and he was just relentless. Oh, church boy! You know, every time he came around, tried to embarrass him in front of other people. Why would anybody want to be faithful to God if it brings so much trouble? You might get in trouble at work. You're not supposed to talk about two things at work. What are they? Right, religion and politics, right? But what does Jesus say? I don't want to get in trouble. And finally, I'm just going to take it in another direction. What about giving to the Lord? Like giving a percentage, giving a tithe. Like, it's hard enough to live in Miami as it is, right? But being faithful to God is being faithful in all areas of your life. And look, when I mention that, guys, by the way, I just wanted to say this. I don't really care if you give at the Pulse of Miami Church or not. I personally don't need your money. But you should give somewhere for the Lord. You can give to another church, you can give to a ministry, something. And so here's my question, though. If it's so hard to live in Miami, and it's so hard to make ends meet, why would anyone want to be faithful to God if it brings so much trouble when it comes to my finances? Let's open up to Daniel chapter 6 in order to answer this question. Now, remember, last week we talked about Belshazzar. He was the last king. He was actually the crown prince, like historically, but the Bible actually says that he was actually king for like one night before they came in and the Medo-Persian Empire took over. Okay? After that, it's so there's the Medes and the Persians, and so whenever they would take over an area, they would go, okay, who gets to rule this part? And so the Babylon area was actually, or at least the area that Daniel was in, it was actually given to the Medes. And there's a guy by the name of Darius. Now, the Persians were ruled by a guy by the name of Cyrus. We'll talk about him later. But Darius was the king over Babylon now. Daniel chapter 6, verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of times we just think about kings coming in and taking over an area. But there's a problem with that, right? If you're a king and you're coming into a new area, it's not just a military thing. Now you have to bring peace and order into that area. You can't just come in and take over the land, because if you do, it's just going to fall to pieces. It's going to be anarchy there. So you have to have rules and laws, and you have to have people to manage the area and make sure that people are getting fed and all of that kind of stuff. And so they had what they called satraps, who were kind of like the ruling, governing authority. So you had 120 of them. Verse 2, and over those satraps, there was 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps would give an account, so that the king might suffer no loss. So here's Darius. He's in a foreign land. He's trying to set up the government. And his ultimate plan is he wants to be able to go home and leave people there who can actually manage this new area that they actually are in control over. And so Daniel was so good that he got on one of the top 3. And he was doing so good at the top 3, verse 3, it says, then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king had planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So basically, he was going to leave Daniel in charge, and he was going to be able to go home. Wow, that's pretty cool. Here's the problem. He's a Jew. And he's living amongst a bunch of Medes and Persians and Babylonians. And they're like, we don't want a Jew to be over us. Like, we would rather somebody from our neck of the woods to be over us. And so they were rebelling. They didn't like Daniel. They didn't like that this guy who worshipped a different God than them was going to be over them. So in verse 4, then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But here's the problem. They could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. The guy lived such a clean life. In other words, they were trying to dig up some dirt on him. But Daniel lived such a clean and faithful life to Yahweh that they couldn't find any dirt. Here's my question, real quick. Is there anybody in this room that lives such a clean life that if somebody tried to dig up dirt on you, Caleb? Caleb might have memory issues. Danny, yeah. Don't even get it started. None of us really, right? So then they said, you know what? It's his faith. That's what keeps him so clean, but that's going to be his downfall. We could use his faith against him. So they go in to the king. King Darius. Oh, King Darius, live forever. But here's the question. Who really lives forever? It's God, right? So think about that. They're kind of equating the king with a god. Verse 7. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps and the counselors and the governors are agreed. King, we had a meeting and everybody agrees that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, should be cast into the den of lions. King, you're such a great king. You're like God. You're like a god. And you know what? We think that people should just worship you for 30 days. We're not saying that they can't worship their gods. But just for these 30 days, just for 1 month, we think that everybody should worship you. Now, you look at that and you go, oh, come on, king. Like what? Come on, don't be full of yourself. But you know what? We see that in today's society, don't we? Like with movie stars and music stars and stuff, and they surround themselves with like these yes men. Man, you're so amazing, you're so amazing. And eventually they start going, you know what, I really am amazing. And we start seeing our stars and they're just so conceited and they're just disgusting, right? But that happens when everybody says that you're so amazing. And here they are saying, hey, we think that people should worship you. I want you to think about that. So they're saying to him, you're like a god. Verse 8, now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Now, I just want to pause on that for a second. That is a super, super important thing for you to remember when it comes to the Medo-Persian Empire. They believed that their kings were so godlike that once a king made a decree, it was infallible. Okay? In other words, once he made it, it was perfect. And so if he made it and he was perfect, then he couldn't admit that it was a mistake. It's kind of like the Pope, right? How they say that everything that the Pope says is infallible. Okay? It's not really true. He's a human being. He can make mistakes. There's only one person in all of history that has ever been infallible. Okay? That was Jesus Christ. Right? Because he is God. He really was God, or is God. So here's the thing. The only person that can actually stand to that kind of scrutiny, that your word is forever, is God. Think about that. But they knew how to trap the king. Sorry, my glasses aren't with me today. So verse 9, therefore King Darius signed the document and the injunction. So the big question now is, what's Daniel going to do? What's Daniel going to do? He's, again, been put into a situation between either being obedient to what the king says or being obedient to God and risk death. And I'm sure that there were plenty of Jews that lived in the area that were faithful to Yahweh, that were like, maybe for 30 days, I won't worship Yahweh. Or if I do it, I'm going to do it in my closet so nobody can see. What will Daniel do? This is amazing. Verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, when he heard the news, he went back to his house, where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. He didn't even close the windows. And he got down on his knees 3 times a day, and he prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Daniel goes, you know what? I don't care what the king says. I don't care if it costs me my life. I'm not going to stop worshiping my God. Well, now, the trap has been set. Verse 11. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making a petition and plea before his God. So I'm sure that they had to bust in the doors. Aha! We got you now, Daniel. Verse 12. Then they came near and before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? By the way, being cast into the den of, how dramatic is that? Right? It's kind of like being cast into a furnace. You've seen some of the similarities between the stories, right? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast. Yes, I did, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Here's where they got you, king. Verse 15. 13. Woo. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. This guy Daniel, who you plan to make ruler over the entire kingdom, doesn't even listen to you. This seems very similar to the story of King Nebuchadnezzar in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Bow down, worship the idol, or we're going to throw you into the fiery furnace. Really similar. But there's a difference in the kings. Because King Nebuchadnezzar gives them another chance, and then when they don't, he gets angry. He gets angry at them, and he's like, I'm going to kill you. But King Darius is different. He saw the value of Daniel. He loved Daniel. And so, this is how the king was different. Verse 14, then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed, and he set his mind to deliver Daniel, and he labored until the sun went down to rescue him. So he got his lawyers around him. They start looking up the laws according to the Medes and the Persians of a way to get out of this. Is there a loophole that we can save Daniel? So he devotes the rest of his day to trying to save Daniel. But he couldn't. Verse 15. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, "Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed." We made sure before we triggered the trap that there was no way out of this. You triggered my trap card. Verse 16. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought, and he was cast into the den of lions. However, before that happened, the king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." I just want to talk about how significant that is. Here's the king, who they were calling godlike. "Oh, king, live forever. Oh, king, you're so amazing. We should worship you." But here's the king who can't even save Daniel from his own word. And it's at this point that he has his humble moment. Remember, King Nebuchadnezzar had a humble moment? Here's Darius, who's having a humble moment and realizing, I am not God. I've tried everything I can, Daniel. I'm praying that your God can save you because I can't. It's that humble moment of realizing I'm nothing, but God is everything. And then, verse 18, hold on a second. 17. Verse 17. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. So he had to be thrown into the lion's den. I want you to think, does this sound familiar to some other story you've heard in the Bible? Where they roll a stone and all hope is gone and he's as good as dead? Does anybody? Maybe Jesus, right? There's a seal that's put on, and it's sealed with the king's signet ring. In other words, there's no way that anybody's going to be able to come in and rescue Daniel overnight without that seal being broken. They would have known. And I do believe that the story of Daniel is kind of a preview of what's going to happen with Jesus, in all honesty. It's kind of cool that we just so happened to fall on this just a couple weeks before Easter. I think that's pretty cool, too. And if you know the story of Easter, maybe you're getting a little hint to what's going to happen at the end of this one, right? Well, the king loved Daniel. He was heartbroken at what was happening. So in verse 18 it says, Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. They probably tried to bring him food. I don't want to eat. I'm not in the mood. I can't eat. No diversions were brought to him. Right? So the court jester who would entertain him, or music, or women, like he didn't want any part of any of it. And it says, and sleep fled from him. I love that. What, has anybody else had that, like some nights where you can't get something off and sleep flees from you? And you're like, come over here, I need some sleep. And it just keeps running away from you, right? So the next morning, the king wakes up, bags under his eyes, couldn't sleep all night, or gets up. Okay? Verse 19. Then at the break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. So he runs over to the den of lions. Verse 20. And as he came near the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. I love the detail of this, right? His tone, Daniel, Daniel! The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? And the way that I picture this is that there's like this pause where he doesn't hear anything. And his heart kind of sinks. But then Daniel, who has probably been resting peacefully all night, finally wakes up. And in verse 21, then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. And you can imagine the king, what? He's still there? He's still alive? Daniel continues, verse 22, My God sent his angel, and he shut the lions' mouths. And they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm. The king got himself some guards, verse 23. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So they broke that seal, opened it up. Daniel was taken out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Not one bite mark. I wonder if he had like some lion slobber on him. Maybe they licked him. Like, ooh, that tastes good, you know. I don't know. I wonder. But then, you kind of wonder. For all the skeptics, so Daniel kind of in the story takes care of the first skeptics that would say, well, maybe somebody came and rescued him overnight and then they put him in there in the morning and that's how the king. No. There was a seal on the door. There's no way that could have happened. And then the skeptics, maybe there was something wrong with the lions. Maybe they had like a stomach ache. Maybe they didn't like the taste of humans. Then there's another little detailed part of the story. And I don't know about you guys, this part kind of feels good, right? The king was then angry. He knew what these people had done. Verse 24, and the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions. Now you're like, yes! And then you see the next part, it's like, ugh. They and their children and their wives. Oh, you kind of don't like that? But can I be honest with you for a second? One of the things that they understood back then that we don't like to admit today is that sometimes your enemy, you might take care of your enemy, but then his kid grows up and his kid comes back and tries to kill you in your old age. Anybody seen The Godfather 2? Remember that one guy, is pretty nasty? Okay. If you haven't, come to my house. We'll watch together. Praise Jesus. But here's the cool part. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Like, have you guys ever seen like some of those Florida, where they have those gator farms, and it's time to feed the gators, and all the gators are like, "Oh, it's lunchtime," and then they throw something, and it doesn't even hit. Like they're like climbing on top of each other and tearing it up, right? And this actually shows us, Daniel is making sure that we understand that it was a miracle that the lions didn't touch him, because they were hungry and they didn't mind eating people. And then the detail, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Like, imagine the sound of that crunch. Whoa. Verse 25. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. He writes a letter to all the people he rules over. Kind of sounds like King Nebuchadnezzar, right? Verse 26, he says, I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. Wow. This is King Darius. He's not a believer. Verse 27. He continues. This Yahweh, he delivers and he rescues and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. I want you to think about this. The king is saying, everything that I'm not, Yahweh is. I'm not all powerful. I couldn't save Daniel. All the things I wasn't able to do, this Yahweh is able to do. And you should worship him too. Verse 28. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Like I said, we're going to be talking about Cyrus over the next month. When you think about Daniel, he went through a lot of trouble. But God put him in a position where he influenced. I mean, he was captive and his life was constantly threatened. But God put him in the proximity of these foreign kings. And I don't know about Darius, But his confession sounds a lot like King Nebuchadnezzar's. Can I be honest? I'm hoping one day when I go to heaven, I can maybe beat King Nebuchadnezzar. But by then he won't be King Nebuchadnezzar. He'll just be King Mr. Nezer. And maybe I'll be able to meet Darius too. But you know who I'll be most excited about meeting? It's Daniel. Besides Jesus. Sorry. It'll be awesome to meet Daniel. Daniel, how did you do it? Wow. And you know what? Here's what I can guarantee you. There's going to be a line. Probably all of us. At least the way that I've taught you guys about Daniel, all of us are going to be like, oh, I want to meet Daniel. I want to meet Daniel, right? And if we ask the question, why would anyone want to be faithful to God if it brings so much trouble? Here's the thing. Being faithful to God allows you get to be a part of God's story. And let me tell you something. God's story is infinitely better than your story. In fact, if Daniel had just done his own thing, he's sitting down, he's getting ready to eat these vegetables or bacon cheeseburger. If he had just gone along to get along and just ate the bacon cheeseburger, we would have never heard about him. But because he was faithful to God, he got to be a part of God's story. And thousands of years later, we're still talking about Daniel. Not because of Daniel, but because of God. He got to be a part of God's story, and it was worth it. Yeah, Daniel could have had an easier life. And I think back to my time in junior high, and it was tough. It left scars and wounds on my soul. And for years later, I refused to open my mouth for Jesus Christ. But can I be honest with you? During those years afterwards, I had a lot more peace. But there was something inside of me that was just like, it was cheap. Like, just living my life for myself was just so cheap. But living your life for God, there's something deeper about it. There's living for something beyond yourself. It's amazing. It's a bigger story. And so, yeah, it's an easier life, but here's what I'm going to tell you. It's a less fulfilling life. Because you get to be a part of God's story when you're faithful to Him. Yeah, people are going to hold you to a higher standard if you're a Christian. But I want to tell you it's worth it. This last weekend I did another funeral. I feel like I'm doing funerals like way too much today, really. But there was a lady, she used to go to our church way back when we were in Tropical Park. And her name was Miss Marguerite. I actually called her Miss Peggy. They called her Miss P. Their family called her Miss P. She was a white Jamaican lady, which that was interesting. And so she came to our church. She was in her late 80s. She used to have like a helper come from Jamaica to help her. And I think the helper came and then invited her. She loved it, which was crazy because she's like in her late 80s into her 90s. And she would come to our church all the time. We had like super loud music and like, a bunch of young people. She loved it. She loved it. But I went to the funeral and I got to meet her family. And hearing the stories, I realized that Miss P lived for more than just herself. I heard how she had impacted everybody's life that was there. And it was a small funeral. But every single person was like, this woman changed my life. She used to talk about Jesus all the time. Most of the time, when she was like in a lot of pain, she would just be like, oh, Jesus, please take me, Or if she was annoyed with you, she was like, oh, Jesus, But she was always talking about Jesus. And I shared that with the family, and then I gave the gospel to the family, and over half of the people that would have raised their hands to receive Jesus as their Savior. And you know what? That wasn't me. That's not me. That was God working through Miss P, Miss Peggy, in their lives. Because she got to be a part of God's story. And she has a legacy. She left this world a little bit nicer than the way she found it. And yeah, sure, if you take a stand for Jesus, okay, you're going to get grief from friends and family. But you know what? That grief only goes until they start going through something. Raul, in his story of that machismo guy at work that would always harass him and all that kind of stuff, he tells the story. You got to ask her about it. The guy came up one day, and he knew that the guy was going through some stuff. And the guy had a folded piece of paper, and he kind of walked by the desk, and he slid the paper over to Raul, and then he just kind of kept walking. And Raul opened the paper, and it said, "Please pray for me and my family." And in that moment, Raul said, "Oh, I realized it was all worth it because I got to be a part of God's story." Yeah, I don't want you to get in trouble at work, guys. I don't want you to go start having religion and politics. I'm not asking you. Here's what I'm going to tell you. Don't be obnoxious or weird when you're at work, okay? Just please don't do that when it comes to Jesus. Like, nobody likes that. But you know what seems to work a lot? Is when you offer people prayer when they're going through some stuff. "Hey man, listen, I heard you're going through some stuff. Would you mind if I prayed for you?" And then if you're really bold, you can pray for them right now. Tabitha actually called me last week, and she texted me. She goes, "I had this friend, and she actually asked me to pray for her. And it's the first time I've ever prayed out loud, and I was praying for someone." Wow. But you see, you got to be a part of God's story that day. She was so excited she was crying. And finally, lastly, giving a tithe, giving part of your finances to the Lord. Like I said, I don't care where you give. I just think it's important when we say, "You know what, God, money doesn't rule me, you rule me. I'm more interested in helping to build your kingdom than building my own kingdom." Michelle and I are finishing up a renovation at the house. And I'm super excited about having you guys come over, enjoy the house. But there's something I can't help but think, because in the process of doing our renovation, we were basically ripping out everything that the other guy had done like 20 years ago. And so there's like this thought in your head, it's like, well, in 20 years, somebody's going to be like, this looks like garbage, and they're going to be tearing it out. But here's the cool thing. When you build God's kingdom, it's forever. You get to be a part of God's story. Man, when you give to a ministry that's leading people to Jesus Christ, man, the work that you're doing by giving is changing people's eternity forever. And I don't know about you guys, but I think that's worth it. Read with me Matthew chapter 5, verse 16. This is our memorization verse. Read it with me now. "In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for people like Daniel. And Lord, so many times we want to read Daniel, we want to think, wow, he was so amazing. But just like St. Patrick, he was normal. And then abnormal things happened to him. He was kidnapped and taken away, and just like St. Patrick. But yet, Lord, you called him to do something amazing. And here's the irony. All of us in this room, if we try to live a life faithful to you, Lord, I know that you're going to call us to do a hard thing. In fact, you're probably going to ask us to do a lot of hard things. And it's a lot easier to not be faithful to you. But Lord, I pray that people like Daniel would show us that it's worth it because we get to be a part of your story. We get to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. And so, Lord, I pray that we would be inspired to be faithful to you in all things, no matter how difficult it is. And it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.